This is a presentation on what to do when you suspect an elder has been abused. I'm coming at this issue from a perspective of a prosecutor, though I do appreciate the community perspective and the safety perspective for elders who have been abused. I'm going to share my slides now. Okay, and let me start the slideshow. Okay, let me see. Display settings. I've got a lot of screens on my computer, so I'm not sure what everybody's seeing. Are you seeing like the big screen with the trolley car?
Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'd like to walk through is kind of the steps that happens after you found out that an elder has been abused, either financially or physically, and what you as a member of the community, a caregiver, a relative, or a friend can do to help make sure that we take care of our elders. So let me tell you a little bit about what I do. I've been a prosecutor for the last 23 years, much of it in San Francisco. And right now I am a chief level prosecutor, and the unit covers, as Junko covered, hate crimes, elder financial abuse, and then physical abuse crimes that involve elders, which is defined in the law as victims over 65 years old. We also handle cases involving minors, so people who are under 18 years old, and that the defendants do not have a specific type of relationship with the victim. So we don't handle cases that involve sex crimes. That's handled by a specialty unit in the office. And we also don't handle cases that involve domestic violence. So that's people who are either in a dating relationship or just one degree of relationship removed, like a child to a parent, or but we will handle things outside of that scope. So like today, I looked at a case that was an aunt and a nephew. So the question that we're trying to figure out today is, what do I do when an elder has been abused? And I think there are three main categories that I'd like for people to think about when you come across a situation. It's the issues around safety, reporting, and how to care for elders. Now, first, we want to consider the safety and stopping the harm. Ask yourself these questions. Is the elder safe? Does the elder need medical care? Does the elder need to safeguard their financial resources? And is the abuser someone, a caregiver, either a relative or somebody who is paid to be a caregiver that has access to the elder? So what we see mostly is these two types of crimes. It's the physical abuse and sometimes neglect, and then also the financial abuse. So when we talk about in the physical side, is the elder safe, right? And that kind of dovetails with the question about the caregiver having access to the elder. So is the elder safe? Has the abuse stopped? And what kind of steps do you need to make sure that it stops? So if there is a need to change a lock, or disable access to some kind of financial account, these are all issues that you want to think about when you find out that an elder has been abused. And then also, I think in terms of the financial abuse, you also want to think a little bit about whether or not the financial abuse has jeopardized some other aspect of the elder's activities of daily life. So whether or not that means, has that put their housing in jeopardy? Are they able to pay their rent or their mortgage or their utilities? Are they able to, you know, access their medical care? Do they need help paying for medical care now? A bunch of these questions, just in the moment, the first step to do is to make sure that the harm has stopped. And then the second step, I think, is to report the harm. And here's where, the encouragement of a friend, or somebody in a position of authority can also help the elder, especially if the relationship between the elder and the abuser is a familial relationship. Because there's a lot of hesitancy to report. Also, people feel shame about reporting. Sometimes they think about what happens to the other person and not just themselves. Or they could also be unfamiliar with the law enforcement system in the United States, and then also feel like they can't trust the police or the court system. So it's important to reinforce with the elder that law enforcement is here to help. If there is an immediate danger, you call 911. If the danger has dissipated, so say the abuser has left the scene, you can also, in addition to calling 911, or let's say that the abuse happened, a week ago, you can also go to your local police station to make a report. It's also important not just to make the report, but to cooperate with law enforcement. And so for physical abuse, that might be, updating the investigator about the medical stability of the elder, whether or not there has been subsequent treatment or additional injuries that were discovered after the initial incident. It could also be things like turning over, in the case of financial abuse, turning over things like bank statements or credit card statements. Or, if it's a caretaker, somebody who's being paid to take care of the individual, records around how often they came to the household, and what their contract required them to do. Also, particularly in San Francisco, we have a language ordinance that requires that services be provided in certain languages, and the police department has on staff people, law enforcement officers who are certified in many different languages, particularly Cantonese, Mandarin, Japanese. I also got a case once with a fluent Italian police officer. So asking for help in the language either you as the reportee need or that the elder needs in order to make the report is something that we will always take care of. And in fact, in the district attorney's office, we do have victim advocates, and Oscar may have covered this in the last month's presentation, but we have victim advocates that speak a variety of different languages, so that people don't have to feel shy about having to speak English or trying to get help in a different language that they're not comfortable with. Also provide supplemental evidence to the police. So again, like if there is something that you find later on, so in the case of a financial abuse case, like if you found some evidence like a check that was written off of the elder's bank account, but didn't have the elder's handwriting on it, had a forged signature or something like that, always bring that evidence back to the police. And if you're ever wondering about what the status is on a case, whether or not it has been presented to the district attorney's office, is it still in an investigative phase? Is the suspect still at large? Any of those questions that come up after the initial report has been filed, you should always feel free to ask for updates on the case from the law enforcement agency that is working on it, that you've made the initial report to. And sometimes it depends on the case, but sometimes law enforcement agencies may also say that a particular case should be investigated by a different agency or can be investigated at the same time and share that information. So, so in the case of, let's say there's a financial fraud and your friend or client is a victim that has been defrauded of $100,000. Generally speaking, a single victim with $100,000 loss might be not a high enough threshold for federal law enforcement officers to want to investigate. They get to pick and choose their cases. At the local level, we take everything. So, but if say that you have that relative or client that has that $100,000 loss, but then law enforcement discovers that there are 10, 11, 12, 20 other people just like that, then that may be a case that the federal government might be interested in prosecuting and investigating. So there might be situations where a case may move from one law enforcement agency to another. Now, the healing after an event, I think, is something that in law enforcement, we don't necessarily always talk about, but I think is one of the most critical periods during this longevity of the abuse, right? So once the elder has, the abuse has been discovered and you're able to stop the abuse and you've made the report, that doesn't mean that the elder does not continue to need help. So I think that in terms of a healing practice around the rupture that's happened in the elder's sense of safety or security, that it's really important that we take steps to make sure that the elder can regain some sense of safety after that. So in terms of abuse, are we able to keep the abuser from being close by the elder? What can we do about that? And API Legal Outreach does a great job of helping with stay away orders, like civil stay away orders for those situations. Sometimes people live in close proximity to their abusers. So say if it's a neighbor, or somebody who also lives in the same congregate living circumstances, like an apartment building or an SRO, then for the elder who has this close by neighbor, it may be very difficult to have a sense of safety. And the civil restraining order at least creates this bubble around them so that they have, very specific legal protection while they are in their place of residence. And that when the police are called, if the suspect violates that or the abuser violates that, then the police have a basis for making an arrest, even if the only thing is violation of the stay away order. Also elders need to continue to get follow-up medical appointments or therapy. You need to make sure to secure the home or financial accounts. And so securing the home means, like, say there's a burglary, a break-in into their home, to make sure that, things are repaired so that they can lock the door again, or that the home is fortified against intrusion again, so that they can feel safe in their homes. And in terms of their financial accounts, it could mean, moving their accounts from one financial institution to another financial institution to start over, so to speak, or to make sure that passwords and access to online access or phone access to the financial accounts are changed, or even that, you call up the elder's bank system, or that the elder puts a flag on their accounts too, in terms of their credit with the credit reporting bureaus, to make sure that their financial identity is also secure. So we also think about connecting with victim services or other community partners for assistance. So the victim services department in the district attorney's office, even if a case isn't charged, victim services will also help any elder who is listed as a victim in a police report. So there are definitely services here in the district attorney's office that can help with some financial reimbursement if there's a violent crime. Also, that can help with connecting elders to different services within the city and county. And I think this last point is actually something that's really important, is that we make sure that the elder does not become isolated because of what happened. A lot of times, as I mentioned before, there can be a sense of shame that, the elder takes the blame for something happening to them, for waiting too long to report, for not knowing what to do or how to protect themselves, or just feels shame about like being vulnerable or gullible or naive about a person's intentions. And the important thing is to make sure that the elder does not blame themselves for something that another person did to them, and that they don't then turn inward on themselves and become isolated. So that they stop going out for walks, that they don't want to go and get their own groceries, that they stop going to community centers to interact with people. Because all of those things, all of those social interactions help not just give an elder companionship or a sense of belonging, but also helps make sure that they are healing internally as well. Now, this next set of slides is what you can expect to happen in the court process after a case is reported to the police. So in terms of the way, let me go back to this slide. In terms of the way that the case goes from the police department to the district attorney's office, the police investigate, they take the initial report and investigate the case. And then once the case is investigated and there's a suspect that has either been arrested or identified, they turn the case over to the district attorney's office. And we review the investigation, the materials that have been presented, and we decide whether or not, based on the evidence, we can prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. And once we make that decision, that we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, then we go to file it. And that can be either by way, if a person is in custody, then we will file it and the person is arraigned in a short period of time. Or if the suspect is out of custody and identified, so a lot of these financial cases go this way, that we would then work with the police department to put out a warrant for that person's arrest. And then once the person is arrested, and they come into custody and the court case begins. So who are the people involved in the criminal court system? So this is just an overview of who the court staff are and the jury. So there is a judge who is the person who makes legal rulings, and during a trial, they basically call balls and strikes. They're kind of like a referee in the courtroom to make sure that both the prosecutor and the defense attorney are adhering to the law. The judge also, after a trial, makes a decision on sentencing if the defendant is convicted. The other people in the courtroom are court clerks. They are the people who keep track of the written documents that make up the records of the court, and they outline everything that happens during a court, any kind of court hearing. There is a court reporter who is the person who is taking down all the words that are said by the judge, by a witness, by the prosecutor, by the defense attorney, so that there is a written record of what happens in court. We also have court security in the terms of a bailiff for every courtroom. There's a jury for a trial, and also court interpreters. So there are a variety of languages, sometimes very, very obscure dialects that the courts are able to procure interpreters for. So language should never be a barrier to seeking justice in the courtroom. Now, on the prosecution side, obviously there's a lawyer who is the prosecutor. And the important distinction here is that the prosecutor is an attorney for the people of the state of California. So it's the public writ large. And the prosecutor is not a lawyer for the victim, although we do often advocate for the position of victims and the viewpoint of victims. There's a victim advocate that is assigned from our office to help victims and witnesses going through the court process and getting financial assistance from the state, say, to pay medical bills. And I think one of the most important roles that our victim advocates play is to be an emotional support for victims when they testify. In California, victim advocates are also available and authorized to sit next to a victim who is testifying, just to be kind of that familiar person to give them just support by their presence, even if the victim advocate isn't saying anything. The prosecution team also includes police officers who are the investigators on the case. And then we also bring forward victims, although sometimes a victim may also testify on behalf of a defendant. On the prosecution side also, we will bring witnesses who either heard, saw, or participated in some way with the incident. So in the case of a physical abuse case, it could be a bystander, somebody who witnessed something that happened on the street. In the case of like a criminal neglect, it could be a doctor who treated the elder from over a period of time and saw some progression of worsening wounds. In a financial abuse case, it could be somebody from the bank who is verifying the bank statements, or a banker that knows the victim personally and saw some interactions with the abuser, the financial abuser, and can testify about that. On the defense side, the people involved obviously are the defendant, who is the elder abuser, the defendant's attorney, who could be privately retained or appointed by the court, could be a public defender, defense investigators who also investigate the case from the defense side. And also they bring witnesses too, who testify what they saw, heard, or have other knowledge of facts that support the defendant's side of the case. Now, I think that for people who don't know about the criminal court system and are victims or possibly witnesses in a case, they wonder, well, when do I have to come to court? And there are a couple of key times that a person may be required to testify. One such time is at a preliminary hearing, if the case is a felony case. And so what that hearing is it's kind of a before trial situation. Some people call it a probable cause hearing, and that is held in front of a judge. And the judge just makes a determination based on the evidence that's presented, whether or not it's more likely that a crime occurred. The defense attorney gets to cross-examine any witnesses that testify at the hearing. And if the victim, him or herself, is asked to give testimony at that time, then the victim advocate can also assist with logistics and sit with the victim during the testimony. The preliminary hearing tends to be shorter than trial. And in the case of elders, we have a special process in California that allows for us to video record the testimony of somebody who is legally defined as an elder, so somebody who's 65 or older, to preserve their testimony for use at a later date if they become unavailable. And so unavailability can be something like, during the trial, the person has to undergo a medical procedure that does not allow them to come to court to testify, or that they have a pre-planned vacation during the trial and they are not going to be in town to testify. And in the case of an elder who passes away, then we can also use that pre-recorded testimony during a trial. So which leads to the other time that a person may be required to testify, which is during a jury trial. So the prosecution must provide evidence of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. It happens in front of a judge and a jury. The defense attorney again gets to cross-examine. The victim advocate continues to be available to assist. And jury trial testimony tends to be more detailed and longer than a preliminary hearing testimony. So where you might expect that the testimony and cross-examination of a victim at the preliminary hearing might take an hour, it might take 2 hours, then trial testimony might be, 2.5, 3 hours long. So I think we also have to deal a lot with people who are nervous or afraid of the criminal justice system. And I think that is a very, very common fear. Most people go through their lives not having any kind of interaction with the criminal justice system, except for maybe being called to jury duty and then being excused from jury duty. So I know that even when there are people who are native English speakers, they're still very nervous or afraid. And you can imagine that if somebody where English is their second language, or they're a monolingual foreign language speaker, that participation in the criminal justice system is completely foreign to them. So, we are here to help. We are here, both the attorneys and the victim advocates, here to explain the process, provide services and explanations in the language of their choice, to help with transportation to court and reimbursement for medical bills, and to make sure that victims have a voice in the criminal justice process. Some of these cases we can't prosecute without direct victim testimony. And so to the extent that we can be of service and actually help bring closure to elders who have been either physically or financially abused, our unit is really, really dedicated to bringing them justice in the way that makes them feel most whole. So on that note, I'm happy to take any questions from people.
Okay, let's give a round of applause to our speaker, Nancy Tung.
So are there, let me check if there are questions in the chat.
I don't think we have any questions in the chat.
Okay.
If you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself, or you may ask it in the chat as well.
So if it's financial abuse, then it will come to us because we handle the financial abuse cases. If it's physical abuse between a child and a parent, then typically domestic violence, the domestic violence unit would take that. But
Thank you. Yeah.
I think the distinction comes from the law, and the technical term is 1 degree of consanguinity. Jeremy, are you going to laugh? Because nobody ever talks that way, right? Except for lawyers. So it means that there is 1 degree of separation between the abuser and the victim. So Like from a parent to child, that's 1 degree, but between a parent, a grandparent and a grandchild, that's 2 degrees. And so that's just the way that we divide the work. So if there's a person who is abusing their grandmother or grandfather in a physical sense, then that case will come to my unit. Again, the same thing for like an aunt and a nephew situation, or like even 2 siblings. The degree of consanguinity is, it goes up to the parent and then back down, so that's 2 degrees. And so we take the sibling violence also.
Yeah, and just to provide some kind of parallels for civil restraining orders, in a situation described, it could be filed as an elder abuse restraining order, or it could be filed as a domestic violence restraining order. So either option is available. There are some, kind of slight differences between which route you go, but the law and process is mostly the same.
Sure, let me restate the question and see if I understand it. So if an elder who has some kind of mental degeneration like Alzheimer's is calling 911, but it's not founded, right? And they're making reports against their children or their caretakers, but it's not founded. So the police department will come out to any 911 call if there's an urgent something about it, right? 911 is reserved for things that are emergent, right? Something that needs attention right away. So if the police come out and there's an accusation, then they investigate it, right? They initially, even at the initial call, they'll make an assessment whether or not there is evidence of what the person is saying. So if the elder says, that person hit me on the side of the head, or stabbed me, or like the elder says, that person stabbed me with a knife 15 times. And the person says, I did not stab them. They're not hurt at all. My mother has Alzheimer's. And they look at the person and there's no evidence of injury. And the person is insisting that they're injured or they were stabbed, and so the police department will make an assessment. That's probably not a great example.
No, I'm talking stealing stuff, like
Yeah, so I mean,
stealing stuff as another kind of like, I'm missing this, I'm stealing that. But you know how the senior is like, oh, I'm missing this, I have to call 911. I got stealing. Must be accusing some of the caretaker.
right.
Having this kind of issues. I have experienced some of the. I know the case like that.
So they might write a report to document it, but then say that they could not find evidence of it. Would it be something that would subject the caretaker or the child to arrest? Would if it's not substantiated at the time of the call, then typically they'll write the report and then they will take no further action. If they think that there's probable cause that a crime was committed, then if it's a misdemeanor, they may write a citation. So if it's theft, they might write a citation for misdemeanor theft if it's under a certain dollar threshold. Or if it's, there's something that they say there's an injury, they might write a citation and say report to court on a certain date, and then let the DA's office decide whether or not to file charges. So the police will make an assessment at the time, right? So if there's a 911 call and they roll out and they talk to the parties, they make an assessment of whether or not a crime has been committed, and then they can write a report to document it, even if if they decide that it was maybe just a suspicious incident. But they will do at least a preliminary investigation.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
If there are none, I have a question, Nancy.
Sure.
I was wondering, you mentioned, you talked a little bit earlier about financial abuse. Like, for example, you mentioned that a banker might be a witness. And so I guess I was wondering, to what extent your office is involved in, I guess like prosecuting, some of these kind of like recent large like financial scams, like involving, crypto, scams or people being, elders being scammed online. Junko and I attended the recent elder conference last week at UC Law Staff, and there was a lot of discussion about like pig butchering and the work of the Santa Clara District Attorney's Office spoke about how they're prosecuting some of these like pig butchering scams. So I was wondering if there's a sort of similar work that you're doing in your office.
Sure. So I know that there are a couple of cases like that under investigation right now with the San Francisco Police Department. We have not been presented one for charging as of yet. And to give a little bit of background for people, the term pig butchering has been given to these scams where people will contact an elder over WeChat, or they'll call them up and then just to kind of develop friendships with them, random text messaging, and then they develop some level of trust, and then they offer some kind of like, you won't believe it, kind of investment opportunity to people. They're buying crypto or an investment in some company or stocks or something along those lines. And then people will give thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars to perfect strangers. And so it is quite concerning because a person's whole life savings could be wiped out. And particularly in the API community, in the Chinese community in San Francisco, this is something of concern. We went through a spate of blessing scams about 10 years ago where it's a scam that was imported from mainland China in a particular village in China that they would come over and prey on elderly people's superstitions about ghosts and something bad happening to their family members and trying to prevent something bad from happening to their family members. And so the people who did the scam would tell the elder to go home and get everything of value so they could bless it, like any kind of cash or jewelry, things of value that they could put like in a pillowcase or a plastic bag. And they would come over and they'd bless it, make a switch, and then with like water bottles or small pouches of rice, and then give it back to the elder and say, now don't look at this for a week. And then the ghost will stop following your grandson or something like that. So, it's definitely something of concern. And I think a lot of times we don't pay enough attention to the cognitive decline for some of our elders that at some point in time, because of, just age, that they don't have the same type of filter that they would have had 10 years ago in terms of assessing people's credibility, whether or not somebody is lying to them, whether or not a person is being too friendly to them. And so as you get older, there's a term for it there. A gerontologist told me about this type of mental decline, and oftentimes the elder is not even aware of it. And so it makes it puts an additional layer of complexity on top of that, so that how do you have this discussion with like an aging parent or a grandparent about, you can't trust everyone that is talking to you. You can't trust strangers that are talking to you online. You can't trust people who are trying to, help you make a deal that will, give you 10 times as much money as you put in. So it can be really complex to try to cut this off at the pass.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I did have a follow-up question because you mentioned bankers as witnesses. So I guess like to what does that mean that the I guess your office has had experience like looking into whether banks have been negligent in allowing, seniors to, negligent, I guess it's not the right word, but to withdraw large sums of money for these scams.
So, I mean, there's a really fine line there, because it's like, if the elder is not incapacitated, like if they're still competent and they are withdrawing these sums of money, it's their money. The banks don't actually have a legal basis to stop them from, taking all of their money out and moving into another bank, right? So there are times where, suspicious activities might raise a question in a banker's mind, and they may report that at some time. But in terms of liability for the bank for their participation, that's not typically where we're going with, having bankers as witnesses. It's more like if they're a custodian of the records, or like if they had an interaction with the victim or the alleged abuser, then we might bring them in to discuss what that transaction was like.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, can I speak about that too?
Yes.
Hi, Nancy.
Yes,
This is
Junko.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for answering the questions, and I have a question. So, I wanted to think about elaborate the accountability of banks and the bank tellers, because they are the ones that who interact with seniors. And I have a financial abuse client who was actually detected by one bank that you are a victim of financial abuse. And he went to another bank and moved his money to another bank. And he became a victim of financial abuse at the bank. And the teller was okay to wire the money to the third party. And then so the senior visited that bank many times until he lost everything.
Yeah.
That what happened to him. And then, so at some point that the banker teller probably was sensing some sort of this, financial elder abuse. And so at the conference I attended recently, I thought that because the financial elder abuse is so up on the rise in this community, it's over 30 billions of industry of financial frauds and scams, and then seniors get all that phones every day, text, emails, and we know that.
Yeah.
So they are so vulnerable too. And with that cognitive decline, sometimes with that, and then so that I thought that the banks are the fault to protect seniors. I wanted to emphasize that area because, and we need to have a screening system or how to educate banks and banks tellers how to screen the seniors on the fault. Yes, that's I wanted to discuss and talk with you.
Sure.
How you.
Sure. I know that there have been some discussions between elder justice advocates and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about what we can do in order to make sure that banks are more proactive about protecting seniors' finances. I mean, like I said, it's a very fine line between, where a person is, entitled to handle their money in the way that they want to, so long as they're competent to do so, versus, well, how do you know it's a scam, right? And what can you do as the bank legally to say, no, you cannot withdraw it, right? If somebody tried to tell me that I couldn't withdraw money from my bank, I might be pretty angry about it, right? It's none of your business what I do with my money. And so what kind of additional duties are we putting on banks? Are we putting additional legal duties on banks? Does that require legislation in order to do it? Right? Or is that something that we can, get some better understanding around in terms of, having cooperation between the banks and law enforcement? So it's a complex question, right? Because at some point, like you can't just take away all of their rights because they've turned a certain age, right? You can't presume that an 80-year-old doesn't know how to handle their finances and that they shouldn't be able to withdraw their money if they want to. So it's a balance, right? It's a question of how much does the banker know? Are they asking more questions? Do they have to ask more questions? But I do think that banks could be more proactive about it in terms of, saying, hey, well, what's the money for? Like they could just ask a few more questions, right? So
Right. So yes, that's where I would like to look at the accountabilities of the financial institutions. And so like if somebody at the conference said, maybe that teller should be screened, that the two people look at the some amount of, large amount of transactions.
Yeah.
If the age, let's say 65 and over, and then ask just a short question, what this money is for, and what are you doing? Kind of very kind, gesturing questions, just to speak. All right, sorry about that. I took time.
So for those of you interested in talking more about this topic, to Nancy's point, there is legislation that's going through the pipeline now that may address this issue.
So, I would see if the DA's office would designate somebody again, or at least give you one point person to kind of be your liaison. If they have no kind of elder justice community in Fresno, I'd be surprised if they wouldn't at least give you one point person to say, this is a case that was reported. Is there any movement on it? Was it presented? Do you need additional evidence? Does it need to go to the police department? And actually working with the police department can be helpful to get cases moving. Yeah, I think that if you feel like there's been a marked change in the way that cases are processed through the DA's office, then you can bring it to the the management's attention. Say, is there a way we could get somebody with this type of expertise, or like somebody who will build that expertise to be the point person for elder justice cases? Because I do think it's important. It's for somebody who doesn't deal with this area of law very often, it might not be as readily apparent. So
Okay.
yeah, I would suggest that. Just, is there any possibility of getting somebody who's, a dedicated elder abuse attorney?
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And sometimes offices are looking for that kind of feedback and they'll prioritize it, especially if you have a good working relationship with your DA's office. So sometimes it's just that nudge, like they didn't think they needed to replace a person, but obviously it sounds like they do.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions if anyone would like to ask a question. Thank you so much for our robust discussion so far.
Yeah, I think that's a hard situation. I don't really have any good advice around that in particular. I do, like, when my husband and I were going through our own home purchase during COVID, there were a lot of warnings around, you know, how to wire money, like don't take, like, there's only one specific way to do it, and this is the way that the escrow company wants the money. And so I think it's, you know, those types of frauds are really difficult. Sometimes they're inside jobs, honestly, because of the way the transactions go. Like, somebody is anticipating a request for a deposit. And so, yeah, I don't have a lot of good advice for that one. That's tough.
I can comment a little bit on it, although I don't necessarily know how comforting it might be. You know, oftentimes in these, you know, scam cases, it's very difficult to find the scammer, and that's the big difficulty. I mean, it sounds like this, you know, your client's done everything right, you know, reporting it to the FBI, you know, things like that. But, you know, without, and sometimes, you know, for cases like, you know, eventually, you know, they are able to find the scammer even after several months have passed. But I think those cases, unfortunately, are few and far between. As I mentioned earlier, you know, there are some efforts. I guess it's not quite the same type of scam you mentioned, but like that it seems to be a growing field for you know, prosecuting these types of cases involving digital scamming. But it's still kind of a new burgeoning field. And then as far as bank notification, on the civil side of things, you know, there have been some efforts to try to hold banks responsible, like from a civil perspective for civil negligence. But the case law isn't always favorable for those cases either. So I guess to summarize, to say that there have been some efforts in that direction, but you know, I think there's still the law and such still has a long way to go to help for those types of cases.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. If I did have one, it's a little bit more in the weeds. I was very surprised, Nancy, to hear you say that you're allowed to pre-record testimony for seniors. And I guess I was just curious, like, how does that mesh with, like, isn't there a constitutional right to like cross-examine the
Right.
the other side? So how does that work?
So it takes place in the context of a courtroom where the defense is able to cross-examine the witness. So what we call it a conditional examination. It's a provision in the penal code specifically for people who are over 65 or people who are about to leave the jurisdiction. So like my first conditional exam was of a doctor who was about to start a new job as a cruise ship doctor, right as my case was going to trial. So so what we did was we brought in the doctor. I made the motion to the judge. We brought in the doctor. The doctor raised his hand and you know, testified, and I did an examination as if it were a trial examination. So the conditional exams are supposed to be a substitute for what happens in trial. So the same exhibits that I would have used during a trial examination for the points that I wanted to prove, the elements of the charge that I wanted to prove. And then the defense attorney gets an equal opportunity to examine the witness as well. So it does have those built-in constitutional protections about the right to confront witnesses. And so once it's been videotaped, then the defendant's right to confront the witness has already been protected because they've had counsel who have, you know, exercised that right for them.
Thank you. Okay, let's give another round of applause to Nancy Tung for speaking today.
Thank you everyone for being here. I think making sure that we have good information in the hands of our community partners is one of the best ways to help elders if they've been abused, but also working together, we can also help prevent elder abuse as well.